Hi, my name is Keith Cooper, and in this short video I'm going to look at taking an image, colour image with very strong colours in it, and making a print. And the reason for picking this particular image is because it covers a lot of examples of choosing colour spaces and aspects of colour management in going from an image on the screen to a print. Now here's the print. Doesn't really matter what printer I used for this, although in this instance it was an Epson XP15000, and I'll mention a bit more about why that printer made a difference for this print a bit later, but that's the end result I'm looking for. But if I start off, I've opened the raw camera image in Adobe Camera Raw. Now I'm quite specifically using an old version of Photoshop here, Photoshop CS6, because I do not need any fancy tools or anything to do what I'm going to do in making this print. The image was taken some years ago in Colorado in the fall, and it's a picture of some aspens against a very intense blue sky. But if I remember right, it was taken in the Rocky Mountain National Park. Now, this monitor here, BenQ SW2700, is a wide gamut monitor, but as I mentioned, it's not quite enough gamut to get this picture in. This picture is actually quite unusual in that it really pushes the gamut limits of all kinds of aspects of making prints. But I'm going to edit this image using a large colour space. Now normally I edit images using Adobe 98, which is perfectly good for print work. If I'm using web use, then I'll reduce pictures afterwards to sRGB for web use. But for this instance, I happen to know, because I've looked at this picture beforehand, I happen to know that some of the yellows here are beyond the gamut of Adobe 98. Now that actually means they can't be displayed on this monitor. Now this monitor is set for D50, quite a low colour temperature, quite useful for printing if you're prepared to experiment a bit and get used to it. Compared to a normal monitor, it can seem quite dull, but for print it can actually help. But it's something for more advanced use, I'd say, because you need to experiment and get a feel for using a monitor set for this. One reason I've set it here for D50 is it works a lot better on the video. If I had it set to the normal D65 or 6500K, it would look very blue on the video. It will still look slightly blue on the video, but you will be able to get a much better idea of the colours, particularly since I'm shooting this with a mix of a bit of daylight coming in and LED halogen replacement lamps. So colour temperature in the room here about 3K, 3.5K. Monitor is set for roughly 5K. Normally you'd set it for 6.5 D65 or something like that. But I'm just going to show the principles here rather than the actual adjustments and things that you need, because by taking simple software like this, you could do this equally well on an oldish version of Lightroom. You could use Affinity Photo or anything for editing it. It's the principles that matter, not the specific software. Now I've got lots of examples of making prints and doing things in the reviews of different printers, and also about making prints. Some of the videos I've done about making prints with specific videos. They go into settings for printing and things like that. That to this doesn't really matter. So I've opened up this image here. One of the adjustments I want to make is I know when I took this was using a Canon 1DS Mark III, so it was a 21 megapixel image. It's on auto white balance, and with a strong blue like this is at about 7,000 feet, 7,000 feet, so there's quite a bit of UV in the light, and it's a very strong deep blue. The yellow here looks a little light yellow. It's not quite right. And if I look at the color temperature that the camera has recorded, it's estimated about 4600 as 4600K as the temperature. Now that temperature is almost certainly too low a temperature, and a more realistic temperature would be to take this up to about 5000. Now if I take it further, you should be able to see even on the video, we've got a lot more orange on this. Now whilst I remember these were a yellowy orange colour, they certainly weren't this colour, so that's far too far. So we only really need to knock it up a little bit to just say, let's say 5200 or thereabouts, just a little bit, just to push the colours. Now when I open up this image, I'm also, because I'm going to do a print, I'm going to bump up the vibrance a bit. It makes the picture look a bit more intense. And remember that I'm going to print it, and the print that I'm making is actually on a rag paper. It's a smooth rag paper, the Canson paper that I've tested with 1 or 2 printers. Smooth surface, quite a wide gamut it's got with dye-based inkjet printers, which is one of the reasons I chose the 15,000. Could have used something like the Canon Pro 200 or whatever, but this is more typical what you would get results in a sort of dye-based, a cheaper printer rather than an inkjet that uses pigment inks. So I've pushed the vibrance up a little bit. Things to notice about photos, taking photos at altitude. There is a distinct chance when printing, because I'm using a large colour space like this, that the sky may shift magenta a little bit, or a little purplish look to it. Now it actually happens if you look out on a very clear sky, a clear day, when the sky is a deep blue, you may be able to detect a slight tinge, purplish tinge. That's there. But in print, it looks wrong. If you shift to a purplish tinge to your skies, it really does look quite wrong. But all I'm going to do in this adjustment, because it's exposed well, I can tell by looking at the histogram, there's no overexposure, and everything's fairly well balanced. But the difference between this and just many other shots I've got is this actually has such a strong range of colours in it. And as I say, these yellows are out of gamut, so they can't be displayed on this monitor. Now, you have to be careful when editing colours that are out of gamut. I happen to know by checking, using some soft proofing, I'll show a bit of this in a moment, that actually most of these colours are within gamut for this particular paper on the particular printer I'm using. So that's one of the reasons I'm using ProPhoto. Normally I would not recommend using ProPhoto because you're potentially editing colours you can't see on your monitor. I've got a nice high-end monitor here with a wide gamut. That's normally all I need, but in this instance I'm just pushing it a little bit further. But anyway, in opening the image, I've now got it here in Photoshop, and I've cropped it a little bit because I don't want quite such a long image. Remember, I want to fit it roughly to this A3 Plus 13 by 19 sheet. Now, I've sharpened it a little bit, and I've actually used Topaz Gigapixel AI to resize this 21 megapixel image to probably the equivalent of about an 80 megapixel image, and then reduced it again. And you think, well, why expand it and then reduce it? Well, I've not reduced it by quite as much as I've expanded it, and it actually brings out some really nice fine detail. Now that's another matter altogether. That's just something I happen to do. You could use all kinds of tools, but you do need to sharpen a little bit for print. The only real adjustment I'm doing for this particular image, and here's the image as taken from the raw file, as converted and after cropping, is I'm using a Hue Saturation Adjustment. All I've done is I've changed the hue of the blues slightly away from the purple by no more than 1 or 2 steps, a very small amount. I've also taken the yellows here and increased their saturation ever so slightly. Now these are minor adjustments. The print would be fairly close as is, but I know that when I come to print, this image here will not be the same as the print. It's never the same as the print. This is a screen emitting light at a particular colour temperature, and what you're seeing here is a print with light reflecting from wherever the light is coming from. So there is a difference. Part of the experience of printing and I always suggest when you start with new papers using known test images, is you get a feel for how the print differs from the screen. So in this instance, I know I just want to bump the saturation up a little bit. I want to change the blues a little bit so they're less inclined to come out a bit purplish. These are minor adjustments, but I can't really rely too much on the screen for some of these because remember, they're out of gamut for this. So whilst I will see some overall colour changes, I won't see the colour changes as they come out in the final print. Now I can use soft proofing here, and I can switch to the proof colours, and that's a proof version. There's very little difference, and I doubt it will even show on the screen, on the video here. I can do a gamut warning, which will show me where colours are out of gamut for the particular printer and paper that I've chosen. In this instance, the Canson Smooth paper. There are little speckles of grey, which is the colour I use on this to show up gamut warning, but there's very little. Conversely, if I was to actually go to the proof setup here and change it from the Canson, as you see, there's a lot of profiles on this, to Adobe 98, you'll see vast areas showing up grey. Now, these are areas of colours that I can't truly display on the screen. Now, this doesn't really matter. There are always colours that you can't display on the screen. But it does mean that when you edit images, you should be very careful in editing them and not edit them that much. Because normally I'd be working in Adobe 98, the screen display is Adobe 98, what you see is what you get, a slight adjustment here is a slight adjustment on the print. But I do have to be careful here because, I'll just cancel that, I do have to be a bit careful here because I'm editing colours beyond the gamut of the screen. I say this is unusual, you don't normally do it. And I can turn off the gamut warning there and go back to that. Now I've got this image, doesn't need a lot doing. I think there was a couple of dust spots on it needed removing or something like that, very little. And I'm going to print it, go to automate, and I'm using the Epson print layout software here, purely because it's easy to use, it's free. If I was printing on a Canon Pro 300, Canon Pro 200, I'd use the Canon software here. So once again, I'm not going to go through the details of the settings here because that depends on what printer you're using, but it's just the broad principles of it. Here's Epson print layout. It needs to import the image data, and it will give a soft proof. Now, because I've set this up before, we have a media type of velvet fine art in this instance, A3+, that's 13 inch by 19 inch, rear feed. I'm printing just the standard mode here, doesn't need to use the high quality mode, makes very little difference on most things. Orientation, layout. The layout works nice and easy on this. Same for the Canon software. What I would say is if you've got a specific printer, then there's a fair chance I've done a review of it, and have a look at the review of that because then I cover the details of printing and the various settings. But the key bit here is I have selected to use an ICC profile for that particular paper. And there we've got that. That's showing a how the image is going to look. You might find that changing the rendering intent between perceptual and relative colorimetric makes a slight difference. If one looks better than the other, use whichever looks best. It's giving a rough soft proof here of what it thinks the image is going to look like, and then it's just a simple matter of printing. Now, I'm not going to show the printing. Suffice to say that that's what came out. Now, one of the important things in looking at prints, when you do prints, is to look at the print as something in its own right. Now, the absolute worst way to compare a print with the screen is just to hold it up like that. Light coming out, light coming reflected. There's just no way you're going to get an accurate match. Far easier to hold the print off to one side, reasonably lit in the kind of conditions you want. Look at the image here, turn your head, look at the image here. So you actually physically move your head. Now, the physical movement in a way resets some aspects of the colour management of your visual system so that you see less of a change in a way that putting the two next to each other simply doesn't work. So I'm looking here, I'm looking at that, looking here, and that comes out a very nice print. What am I going to change if I was to print this again? And this is one of the things that comes with experience. This is close, but it's not quite close enough. What would I adjust? I would go back to that adjustment I made in Photoshop, where I changed the intensity and the colour of the yellows here. This is perhaps fractionally too orange. Now, this is really quibbling, and the real test of this is to take your print, show it to somebody else, ask them what they think. What they will look at is this a print they like? People are very forgiving for slight differences in colour, and in fact I think if I printed this one more accurately, so it would be ever so slightly yellower than this in the trees rather than slight orangey shade, I suspect more people would like this one. Remember, it's about what the print looks like, not what this looks like. Concentrating on too much on what something looks like on screen is great if you're just going to show it on the web or something like that. But if you're making a print, always remember that the print is the final arbiter. Now, I could print this on a different paper, and if I printed it on, for the Epson XP15000 here, if I printed it on a luster paper, I wouldn't get quite the range of colour here. If I printed it on a gloss paper, depending on the gloss paper, I might get the same range. If I printed this with pigment inks, I'd probably get a slightly flatter look to the image. But that depends on the printer. So if I printed this on an Epson P900 or P700, it would look different to printing it on an Epson P5000. Now, P5000, bigger printer, 17-inch printer, has pigment inks again, similar to the Epson inks there, but has more inks and has a wider gamut. Now, I've looked at the gamut of this particular image in soft proofing against different printers, and I found that the printers and papers for this particular image here, and if I say perhaps on this Canson paper here, the Canon Pro 200, the Epson XP15000 could easily manage these colours. The Epson P5000, and I would assume, although I don't have a profile for this particular paper, that would the Canon Pro 1000 would easily manage the colours here. If I go to the P700, or the P900, or the Canon Pro 300, try not to mix these numbers up, the colours wouldn't be quite so intense. But on a different paper, it could easily manage them. So the whole point of this is that In deciding to try and print a high colour image like this that has a wide range of colours, very strong intense colours, whether you're going to be able to get a successful print depends on the type of paper you're using, the printer and the inks you're using, your settings here, your adjustment settings, quite a lot of things. Now, for most images, it's actually far easier just to print. There's none of these messing about with colours. I've got Adobe 98 monitor here. I use Adobe 98 as my working space, and the prints come out fine. So this is a deliberate, extreme example I've chosen to try and show some of the issues that you have to face. If I took some papers, I would get slightly better results. But all of this lot counts for nothing if it's a rubbish photo. So remember, always, before you get too lost in all this colour management stuff, always show your image to somebody who really doesn't know a thing about colour management. Ask them what they think about the picture. If they say that's a great picture, then good. They can tweak, you can tweak the colours, you can change your papers and do things. If they went, yeah, alright, don't particularly like it, colour management counted for nothing in that instance. Just a little thing to remember before you get too sort of locked up in all of this stuff. Anyway, I hope this has been of use, sort of a look at an extreme example of printing an image, and thank you very much, and do consider joining and subscribing to the channel. I've got lots more things like this I'd like to do short videos of, so I appreciate questions and suggestions to what to do, what things to cover. So thanks.